As Israel slides further into rebellion, a number of prophets take the stage. Initially, the prophets function as covenant enforcers, calling Israel to return to God and to their vocation. But as Israel continues in her apostasy, the prophets turn to the future. God will not let Israel's rebellion derail his purpose. The prophets give Israel hope that their covenant history is not over. Even though he has abandoned Israel in judgment, God promises that he will return to establish his rule over a future worldwide kingdom, ushered in by a son of David who will gather, forgive, liberate, and renew Israel. At last, all nations will be incorporated into his kingdom and will bow before his sovereignty. This messianic king will come in power and glory as a world ruler. And yet somehow, this restoration is also puzzlingly linked to the appearance of a suffering servant. The coming of the kingdom will be a work of the Spirit as an end-time event. God will bring judgment and salvation first to Israel and then to the nations. The Spirit will renew the covenant and write the law on Israel's hearts. Thus God will form a faithful Israel in the last days. The nations will see and know that Yahweh alone is God, and they will join with the people of Israel to enjoy his salvation. The prophets inspire hope in Israel. God will complete his purpose. The end will be nothing less than the renewal of the entire creation when God will restore all things. The knowledge of the glory of God will cover the earth as the waters cover the sea, and all people will acknowledge that Yahweh alone is God. Israel's hope is now set firmly on this future. This flame of hope is fanned when the Persian king Cyrus decrees that Israel may return to their land. Perhaps the day has arrived. Under Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah, Israel returns to rebuild the temple and the walls of Jerusalem and to live on the land. Though only a small portion of the people return, their expectations are high. Moses had promised restoration, and this was fueled by the prophets. But these lofty expectations were soon dashed. Israel did have their land again, but only a small portion of it, which they held as tenants of the Persian Empire. There was a Davidic descendant ruling in Jerusalem, but he governed only under the watchful eye of Persia. They had a temple, but it looked nothing like Solomon's beautiful temple, let alone the glorious temple promised by Ezekiel. Israel was again a people, but they did not enjoy the transforming renewal they had expected. Discouragement set in, and there was a crisis of faith among the returned exiles. The message of Ezra and Nehemiah to a disheartened people is that Israel's return had truly been a work of God. He had sovereignly orchestrated their return and the building of the temple, the rebuilding of Jerusalem's wall, and their covenant renewal. The promise for those who now had returned was that they did and remain a part of God's ongoing plan and were called by him to perform their role faithfully. However, God's ultimate purposes were awaiting a greater fulfillment, a better leader, a better temple, a better Jerusalem, and a better covenant renewal to form Israel into the new humanity they were called to be. And so their subjection to the world powers continued, even now that many were again on their own land. Under Ezra and the Levites, Israel confesses in Nehemiah 9, "We are slaves today, slaves in the land you gave our ancestors." They groaned beneath the rule of Persia and then Greece and finally Rome, the cruelest of them all. During this time, Israel looked back and interpreted their history through the lens of Deuteronomy 27 through 30, where Moses had promised blessings for faithful adherence to the Torah, but warned of curses that would lead finally to exile. This, they believed, is precisely what had happened to them. Israel's predicament in exile illustrates the tension that existed throughout the entire Old Testament story. On the one hand, Israel had been created to be the new humanity, formed by the Torah in the way of blessing as the beginning point of God's purposes to renew all peoples. On the other hand, Israel remained part of the old humanity. The Torah could not reform them. They had sown covenant rebellion and reaped the curse. Their ongoing exile was a living daily reminder of their continuing participation in Adamic humanity under sin and its curse. The exile was evidence that Israel under the law was no solution. How would God keep his promise to restore blessing to the world? How would he deal with sin and its curse? How would he liberate Israel from covenant curse so that Israel and all nations might be blessed? But Israel not only looked back, they also looked forward, believing that their story was not yet over. After all, the words Moses had left with them did not end their count of their exile in Deuteronomy 27 through 29, but continued on in the next chapter to the promise of restoration in Deuteronomy 30. And this promise was reinforced by the prophets. God would deal with sin and the curse. God would gather Israel back and restore blessing. He would change their hearts and give them back the blessing they had forfeited. God would have compassion and give them new hearts to turn to him, to love him with their whole hearts, and to obey his law and live. The mouth of the Lord had spoken it. And so they waited in hope.